Shalom, everyone. It's time for ancient Jewish wisdom for a modern world that will change your thinking and change your life. Welcome to the Dust of the Rabbi podcast with Rabbi Baruch Bileci.
Shalom, everyone. Rabbi Brian, so glad you've joined us for another episode of the Dust of the Rabbi podcast. And we are today in episode number 4 in our second season, as we've been learning how to become a disciple of Yeshua. We've learned in episode 1 how to be a follower. We've learned how to be a learner in episode 2. And last week we did episode 3 on becoming a giver. So today we're going to go into a whole nother lesson and a level of discipleship. And we're going to learn how to become a lover of God and a lover of his people today. So I'm going to show you the background, what Jesus taught his disciples on how to be a lover of God and a lover of people. And we're going to go back to some famous ancient texts today as we download ancient Jewish wisdom from the Torah and look at the Torah teaching of Jesus so that we can sit at his feet, become dusty with the dust of his feet, and drink in his words with thirst. And I love the fact that you're listening audibly to this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Audible, all different platforms, as well as watching us on YouTube on my channel. I'm so grateful that you're following us, Rabbi_Brian, Instagram, Twitter, or now that they call it X. You can follow us, send in questions, comments, thoughts, and concerns, and just find out what it means to walk in the footsteps of the Messiah. And this is a 2,000-year journey to take you back and become a disciple of Jesus, a disciple of Yeshua, as we like to call him in Hebrew. So today we're looking at our 4th episode, 2nd season, becoming a lover of God and his people. You ready? Let's get into it. All right, so we're going to take a look at just something we looked at the first episode of this new season, and we looked at the disciples by the dozen, and we saw that there was an inner circle around Jesus, as well as a supporting, surrounding, and outer circle. And one of the disciples I want to talk about today, who's going to give us a little highlight on what Jesus taught about being a person of love, a lover of God and people, is the disciple in the inner circle around Yeshua, and that is John. I want you to think about God, who's a creator, and he loves us unconditionally. But as my dear friend Lisa Bevere says, he doesn't love us equally, he loves us uniquely. And if you haven't checked out her podcast and her book, Adamant, you got to check it out. Me and her had some great dialogue. I think in chapter 3 and 4, we talk about God who loves, and actually a God who has to hate sometimes, because you have to hate that which unmakes love. So great book to check out. If you haven't checked out Lisa and John Bevere, man, just amazing men and women of God, their children, their whole ministry, Messenger International, Messenger X app. You got to download that app. And I'm so grateful to be friends with them. They're paisanos. We are fellow Sicilians, Italians, and believers. And so we're just grateful to have resources like that and people that you can reach out to like that. And also, if you're part of this podcast and you want to reach out, become one of those disciples of Yeshua in this generation, and let me be your personal rabbi. Come on, let's jump into the text. We're going to look at the fact that God is love, and the fact that God is love is greater than he has love for us. Because sometimes we think of love, and we think about people who say they love us, but they love us at the level that they love themselves, or sometimes in the lack of love for themselves, they show us a lack of love. And we know we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves, but you can't love your neighbor if you don't properly love yourself. And you'll never learn how to love yourself correctly with the right respect, with the right boundaries, if you don't love God first with all your heart, soul, and strength. So let's take a look at the idea of God being the source of our love. Look at what Jesus says in John 13:34. He says, "A new commandment I give you." Now think about this. He says something new. So you can imagine all the ears of his disciples perked up when they heard this. "A new commandment I give you." Now they had been learning the commandments since they were a child in Torah study and in Hebrew school, kind of like a Hebrew university for kids, and you grow up as adults and you become a bar mitzvah. A bar mitzvah is not just a ceremony or a party. It's an age of accountability for a young man or a woman. A bar mitzvah for a man at 13 and a bat mitzvah for a girl earlier than 13, age 12, she becomes a woman, going through puberty, going through that change of life, and both the boy and the girl are stepping into their adulthood, and they're taking on the responsibilities of the mitzvot, the commandments of God. And so look at what it says. It says, a new commandment I give you. And remember, all the commandments of God started with Moses giving the 10 commandments, and all the 613 individual commands or details of those commandments that we heard from Sinai through a wilderness, wandering 40 years until Israel made it to the promised land. So when you think about this concept, how innovative is Jesus? He's giving a new commandment. Now we're going to find out if it's really new or not. He says, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. Now you think about that. Okay, that's a simple command. Love one another. How hard is that? You know, when you think about loving your neighbor as yourself or loving one another, it's a simple command that we've already been given in the Torah. So what is this new commandment Jesus is talking about? He goes on to say, not only do I give you a command to love one another, but he says, just as I have loved you. Could it be that Jesus, Yeshua, is raising the bar and saying, I don't want you just to love the other person the way you love yourself, because maybe you haven't been loving yourself the right way. Maybe you don't have respect for yourself. Maybe you don't have healthy boundaries. So therefore, let me teach you as your rabbi. Let me get some of that rabbi dust on your life and learn how to love one another by me being the model of example and loving you first. You know, that's what parents do for children. You're supposed to love your child. You're supposed to love your family and show them the kind of love you'd want them to have when they're parents and they're loving their children and for every generation to follow. So you have to be like a teacher to students. Be the example you want them to live out and especially to learn to live. And as we step into the footsteps of Jesus, we want to love each other the way he loves us. Yes, Yeshua loves us. Yeshua ohev otach. Yeshua ohev otcha. In Hebrew, Jesus loves you. To the male, otcha. To the female, otach. And so when you think about this concept of Hebrew and the language that is so dynamic that it's actually function over form, when you talk about loving someone, it's not the form of love of the words we say. It's the function of the love we act out. And love is an action word. So look at what he says in verse 35. By this, all people know that you are my disciples if you love one another. In other words, the mark of a disciple of Jesus, a disciple of Yeshua, Talmidim Yeshua. That's how you say disciples of Yeshua in Hebrew. When you think about being a disciple, the idea is the mark of the level of love you have, the love of God that is displayed by the rabbi, is what teaches the students, the disciples, the Talmidim, how to love each other. So this is John. This is John the Beloved. Remember, John is in the inner circle with Simon Peter, Shimon Kepha, James, who's really Jacob, or Yaakov, and James's brother is John, or Yochanan. He is the younger brother of James, or Jacob, and they're fishermen, and they were following Jesus to become fishers of men. How are you going to fish for people if you don't know how to love people? How are you going to reach people if you don't know how to show care and concern to people around you? So as we jump into this ancient Jewish wisdom and we download it so that we can become a lover of God and people, I want you to go a little deeper with what Yeshua said. Because if we actually bring you to the table and have a little talk, a little coffee talk, we have to look at the command. Is it really a new commandment to love our neighbor as ourself or to love one another? In fact, the question is the commandment really new or is it really old? And considering whether it's old or new also considers the question, who gave us the commandment first? Is it Moses when he gave us the commandment in Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself? Or is it Jesus who says, I'm giving you a new commandment? And when you think about what Yeshua is saying, he is saying something fresh and new to his disciples based upon a commandment they already know. They know Leviticus 19:18. They know that they should also love God with all their heart, soul, and strength. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. They know about that. They even put the mezuzah on their doorposts. Come on. They put it on their gates. They bind tefillin on their arm. They do all these things that remind them of loving God. They also wrap themselves with a four-cornered garment where they have fringes that they wrap around their finger when they're reading and studying the Torah to remind them of all the 613 commandments, or the acronym for that is called Taryag, the 613 details found in the Torah, not just 10 commandments, 613 smaller details. And really, you could almost put them all in 10 manila folders, if you will, and label them under the 10 commandments. So I want you to also think about how we express this kind of love to God and to his people. And really, the bigger question is your love mature enough, or does it need to grow and develop? These are the kind of questions we have to ask ourselves. When Jesus talked about love, the first thing he taught us was that we should love God the way Moses taught us to love God, with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength, or some versions say with all of our might. And when you read Mark 12:28, you see he gets into a discussion. Here in the Tree of Life version, it reads, one of the Torah scholars came and heard them debating. Seeing that Yeshua had answered them well, he asked him, which commandment is first of all? Now, Yeshua answered and said, the first is, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which translates to, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, or literally, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And we'll find out that there's a little added phrase that it's mentioned here in Mark's gospel when it comes to with all your mind. The original text doesn't say that, but it was a consideration for the difference between Hebrew and Greek, and those that were reading this from a Greek New Testament as this message gets spread around the known Greco-Roman world. So when you think about this verse, and you consider even verse 31 that says the second is, meaning a second in priority, is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Well said, teacher, the Torah scholar said to him. Now remember, we're supposed to sit at the feet of these Torah scholars and get dusty from the dust of their feet. So here's a Torah scholar coming to another Torah scholar, another rabbi, and telling him, well done. In Hebrew, I would say that in Hebrew class, tov me'od, very good, well done. When you think about this Torah scholar who's probably trained in Jerusalem, one of the Pharisees, like the Apostle Paul, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee of Pharisees, for him to validate that what Yeshua the Messiah says is true and is accurate, it's because they're both teaching the same Torah from Moses. The law of Moses tells us to love God with all our heart, soul, and strength. So he says, well done, or well said, teacher. The Torah scholar said to him, you have spoken the truth. That is, he is echad, or he is one. And besides him, in other words, besides God, there is no other. And to love him with all your heart and with all your understanding. Now notice, now we, instead of saying mind, we have understanding. And with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as oneself is much more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. Wow. So imagine going to the temple with your sacrifice, with your lamb and your goat and your ram and your bull and the barley and the wheat and all the first fruits that we bring during the high holy days, like the high holy days that are coming. Just this Friday starts the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And then 10 days after that, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And then 5 days after that, Sukkot. For 7 days, we'll celebrate waving our palm branches and our lulav, our lulavim. The lulav is the 3 branches of the myrtle, the willow, and the palm branch. And we'll wave it with a special citron fruit called a etrog, or these etrogim. And it's going to be a wonderful holiday. And we bring all of the precious fruit of the earth in for harvest time in the fall feast or in the high holy days. Now, this is, again, during temple times we would do this. So imagine this Torah scholar says, beyond all those festivities, loving one's neighbor as oneself is one of the greatest, if not the second to the greatest, of all commandments. First, love God, then love each other. Love your neighbor. So this is very important when we think about this, because the original commandment of loving God comes from Deuteronomy 6:4-7. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Notice mind and understanding were not added in, because this is written in Hebrew. We don't need to make the consideration to the Greek audience to add in those extra words. You should teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house. Think about dinner time. When you walk by the way, think about the sun being out, maybe lunchtime or afternoon. When you lie down, think about nighttime. And when you rise up, think about the morning, when you have breakfast with your family, when you have your morning devotion. 4 times a day should you meditate, study, talk about, and read these special passages about loving God. And again, consider loving your neighbors yourself as one of those important passages of the Torah that we should put as a high priority. Because if you think about it, when the scholar said which commandment comes first, he was not saying first in number or first in order. He was saying first in priority, because truly, loving God with all your heart, soul, and strength was not the first commandment Israel was ever given. If you want to be technical, even before the 10 commandments were given, God gave commandments to keep Passover, to put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, and to select a lamb for the household when Israel was in Egypt, so they could be delivered from bondage before they ever made it to Sinai to get the 10 commandments. In fact, the very, very, very first commandment they were ever given as a people was actually not even just to select the lamb first, but to set aside the month of Aviv, later called Nisan, a holy month or a new way of counting months for Israel. And so you see this in Exodus chapter 12. You can read it and see how all the biblical feasts are fulfilled in not only that passage, but when you continue on with Leviticus 23 and see all the Moedim, the feasts of the Lord, as Sabbath rests for Israel and for the people to celebrate what God has done, what God is doing, and what God will do. Yeah, important to celebrate the feasts of the Lord. But let's go a little deeper now and take a look at really what God is saying in this command. To love God with all your heart is really to love him from your spirit, because God wants all of us. And the only way to get all of us is to go first for the innermost part of us, and that's our spirit man. And to love God with all your soul, sounds a little obvious, is to give God your soul and to love him from your soul. Your mind, your emotions, your will need to be captivated in the affection of God, and set those affections on things above. Surrender that will to the Father's will, not my will, but your will be done, Father. And to renew our minds so that we can really have an affection towards God and the things of God. And then finally, of course, to love God with all your strength speaks of your body. So really, you need to love God spirit, soul, and body. Now, what is this difference between spirit and soul? Well, when we talk about the inner man, the spirit of man is where the heart is the center or core of man's being. So to love God with all your heart means to love him with all of your spirit, where your heart is clean before God, and your conscience is clean, and your spirit is totally right before the Lord. David said, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, renew a right spirit within me." And when Adam was created in the garden in Genesis 2:7, God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. That breath of life became man's spirit. And the neshama, the breath of God that came in, inspired not only spirit, but soul. Soul is what makes us natural human beings, to where we have our own thoughts and feelings and decisions we can make, or free will, because we have a soul, mind, emotions, and will. But the spirit of a man is what connects to God. God is a spirit, and to worship him, we worship him in spirit and in truth. Our bodies are just the outer shell of our inner sanctuary or temple where God wants to dwell. Just like the 3 rooms of the temple and tabernacle, you have 3 rooms: spirit, soul, and body. And your spirit and soul are different. And only the Word of God can divide asunder between soul and spirit. So, very important. To be a very spiritual person, you have to really give your spirit to God. Not just be a soulish or selfish person, where it's what you think, what you feel, what you decide. Because love causes you to love others the way you'd love yourself, and sometimes even beyond the way you would love yourself. And we know that we are created spirit, soul, and body because Paul taught us that in 1 Thessalonians 5:23. So when you think about these commands, God gave us commands like the first 4 commandments at Sinai between God and man, to not have any other God before him because he's the Lord that delivered us out of bondage, no graven images, to not take God's name in vain, and to remember the Sabbath. And then we've got 6 commandments that really speak of a relationship between man and man, and to honor your father and your mother, not murder, commit adultery, not steal, bear false witness, or to covet is really the latter 6 referring to man. Well, if you think about it, the first 4 speak of the 4-letter name of God, Yud He Vav He. The 6 commandments remind me of man being created on the 6th day, and so there's 6 commandments between man and man, while there's 4 commandments between God and man. A total of 10 commandments total, and all of them require love. Because if you love God, you're not going to put another God before him. You're not going to make a graven image. You're not going to take his name in vain. And you're going to keep his Sabbath day. If you love your fellow man, you're going to honor first of all, your father and your mother, who are probably the parents who taught you how to love. You're not going to murder someone. You're not going to commit adultery. You can't steal from someone you love, bear false witness, or covet their possessions because you love them. So what if we did the love test? What if we were to take the love test and actually look at 1 Corinthians 13:4-8, that love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy. And everywhere you have the word love in 1 Corinthians 13, you put your name there. I could say, Brian is patient sometimes. Brian is kind. Brian doesn't envy. Brian doesn't boast. I'm not proud. Every once in a while. Brian does not dishonor others or is self-seeking or is easily angered. Well, I get angry every once in a while. So I'm Sicilian. Blame it on my ethnicity. And then when you think about all these things that love never fails, people that fail you in life, their love has not matured or been perfected. If you really want to learn about love, a great story to read about is the story of the Good Samaritan who truly loved his neighbor. And I think so many times we forget that there's people around us that are in need of God's love. I love the fact that John, the very one that taught us what Jesus said, to love your neighbor as yourself or to love one another as I have loved you, he's even considered the beloved. His Hebrew name, Yochanan, means that God is gracious and that God is such a kind, loving God. And when you think about the disciple that Jesus loved, as John 13:23 says, one of his disciples whom Yeshua loved was reclining at his side. Man, to know that someone loves you or to know that you love them, what a powerful principle that is. Because in the world we're living in, everybody wants love. It doesn't matter who they are, the color of their skin, their age, how young they are, how old they are, what part of the world they're living in. Everybody wants to be loved. Love is so powerful. It goes beyond politics. It goes beyond religion. It goes beyond disagreements. It goes much further than unforgiveness. Love covers a multitude of sins. Love believes all. Love hopes all. Love never fails. Trust me, as a disciple of Yeshua, we would be more effective in the world if we could just love people unconditionally. Love people like Yeshua loved his disciples. And like he loved the world, he was willing to give his life for the love that he wanted to reveal and show to each one of us. You might be somewhere in a room feeling unloved. You might be feeling isolated, rejected, abandoned, or broken, or missing something in your life. The love of God fills every void space. The love of God is like a warm blanket on a cold day. The love of God surrounds you and protects you. The love of God is actually what draws people. The goodness of God, not badness in the world, not the badness of judgment God might have to bring on someone, but the goodness of God, the love of God, God's graciousness, as John understood as the beloved. I think about Song of Solomon 6:3. I am my beloved's is mine. When you think about John being the beloved disciple, the disciple that Yeshua loved, could you be that disciple today? He already loves you, but the more you draw closer to him, the more you will experience that love. See, Jesus loved Judas too. but Judas was in the outer circle, so he couldn't feel the love. If you get dusty from the dust of the rabbi, get as close to Yeshua as possible. Not only will he teach you how to love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, your total being. It's like a vow at a wedding. You make a vow to give your total self to that other person, that person that will be your spouse, your soulmate. This is the way Jesus loved his disciples. This is the way he loves you. So why not just give in? Become his disciple today. Man, I just love the fact that if you love God and you love your Messiah, who is your rabbi, life changes. Look what John said in chapter 14, verse 15. He says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, speaking of the Holy Spirit, so he may be with you forever, the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it does not behold him or know him. You know him, because he abides with you and will be in you. And I will not abandon you as orphans. I will come to you in a little while. The world will no longer behold me or see me, but you will behold me. Because I live, you will live also. Do you know Yeshua is preparing a place for you and I? That's the image of a groom going off to build a house for his new bride as she stays in her father's home and waits for him to return. This is a beautiful picture of Yeshua returning in the last days and the Messiah coming and setting the world right and creating a place where people can feel the love of God again. They feel the love of God every time you share it. But more importantly, when they become disciplined in loving God and loving their neighbor as theirself, they're able to love each other. We're able to love each other as Yeshua loves us. Yeshua ohev otach. Yeshua ohev otcha. He loves you no matter who you are. Just receive that love today. Become his disciple and become a lover of God and his people. Find someone to love in the next 24 hours or in the next week before this next podcast. Practice just loving on people. Pay for somebody's coffee at Starbucks. Buy someone's groceries at the grocery store. Do something kind. Pay it forward. Or just find someone that you can love that maybe can't even love you back. Maybe someone who feels loveless. Man, I hope you enjoyed this podcast today. Don't forget, you can become a lover too. I have, you will too, as we follow in the footsteps of Yeshua the Messiah and become discipled from the dust of his feet. Let's drink in these words this week with thirst. Until next time, when we're going to get into episode 5, and we're going to learn how to become a worshiper. Man, you're going to learn what worship really is. It's so much deeper than what we think is just singing or playing an instrument. You're going to learn the essence, the true aroma of worship. I can't wait to see you on our next episode. See you soon. Shalom. Lehitrot. See you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, follow us for more episodes as you rate and review the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Dust of the Rabbi podcast with Rabbi Brian Baruch Bileci. Shalom. Lehitrot. See you next time.